August 2, 1944. A German observation post near Avranches, western France. The young Gefreiter lowers his binoculars, blinks twice, then raises them again. His hands are shaking. Not from fear, not yet, but from disbelief. Across the valley, through the morning haze lifting off the hedgerows, he sees them. American tanks. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Moving in columns that stretch beyond the range of his optics. Dust clouds rising like signal fires across the horizon. But it's not the number that freezes him. It's the speed. They're not advancing cautiously, probing for resistance, waiting for infantry support. They're racing, engines roaring at full throttle, tracks churning dirt into the summer air, entire armored divisions flowing across the French countryside like a mechanical flood. 20 miles per hour, 25 on roads, through fields, around obstacles, past burning villages. He fumbles for the radio handset. His voice cracks when he speaks. "Command, this is Outpost 7. Enemy armor advancing in strength. Request immediate." He stops. How does he describe this? The manuals never prepared him for this. German panzers don't move like this. Nothing moves like this. The Shermans keep coming, and they don't slow down. To understand the shock rippling through German lines that summer morning, you have to go back 6 weeks. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in human history crashes onto the beaches of Normandy. Over 150,000 Allied troops, American, British, Canadian, storm 5 landing zones under a hail of German fire. By nightfall, they hold a fragile foothold on Hitler's fortress Europe. But holding a beachhead and breaking out of one are 2 entirely different challenges. For the next 7 weeks, the battle for Normandy becomes a grinding, bloody stalemate. The terrain favors the defender. The bocage, ancient Norman hedgerows, turns every field into a natural fortress. Thick earthen walls topped with centuries-old vegetation create a maze of kill zones. German troops dig in. Mortars, machine guns, and the feared 88mm anti-tank guns command every intersection, every farm lane, every sunken road. Allied casualties mount. Progress is measured in yards, not miles. The Sherman tanks, backbone of American armored divisions, struggle in this claustrophobic landscape. They can't maneuver. They can't exploit their mobility. They become targets, sitting ducks for German anti-tank weapons and the heavier Panther and Tiger tanks that stalk the hedgerows like predators. Back in London and Washington, Allied commanders grow anxious. The invasion timetable is slipping. The Germans are reinforcing. Some begin to whisper the unthinkable. What if Normandy becomes another stalemate like the trenches of the First World War? But the German high command isn't celebrating. They're reading their own casualty reports, watching their panzer divisions, the elite armored fist of the Wehrmacht, get chewed apart in defensive battles they were never designed to fight. German tanks are masterpieces of engineering. The Panther with its sloped armor and powerful 75mm gun, the Tiger with its legendary 80mm that can kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. On paper, they're superior to anything the Allies field. Yet superiority means nothing when you're outnumbered 10-1. For every Tiger the Germans field, America produces 20 Shermans. For every gallon of fuel that reaches German tanks through bombed supply lines, American tanks receive 50. The mathematics of industrial warfare are grinding the Wehrmacht down, and German commanders know it. What they don't yet understand, what they can't comprehend because it contradicts everything their doctrine taught them, is that the Americans aren't trying to build a better tank than the Tiger. They're building a faster one. The M4 Sherman, nicknamed after the American Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, entered production in 1942. It wasn't designed to win one-on-one duels with German heavy armor. It was designed to do something the German panzers couldn't: move an entire mechanized army across a continent at unprecedented speed, keep it supplied, keep it fighting, and never stop advancing. The Sherman's design philosophy reflected a uniquely American approach to warfare. While German engineers obsessed over thick armor and powerful guns, creating tanks that were engineering marvels but logistical nightmares, American designers focused on reliability, speed, and mass production. The Sherman used a proven aircraft engine, the Wright R975 radial or the Ford GAA V8, both known for durability. Its relatively lightweight, 30 tons compared to the Tiger's 56 meant it could traverse bridges. German tanks couldn't cross and navigate terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles. Most critically, it could be produced in staggering numbers. American factories churned out nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war. Entire assembly lines in Detroit, Chicago, and a dozen other industrial cities ran 24 hours a day. Workers who'd been building cars were now building tanks with the same efficiency, the same standardized parts, the same ruthless focus on speed and volume. German tankers in Normandy faced an enemy they couldn't defeat through tactical brilliance alone. They could knock out 5 Shermans and there'd be 10 more behind them. They could destroy an entire American tank platoon, and by the next morning those losses would be replaced. The Wehrmacht was fighting the wrong war. They were still thinking about decisive armored engagements, grand clashes where superior machines and superior tactics would carry the day. The Americans were thinking about operational tempo. How fast can we move? How far can we advance before the enemy reorganizes? How quickly can we turn breakthrough into collapse? In late July 1944, as Allied forces finally prepared to punch through German lines, the stage was set for a demonstration of mechanized warfare that would shatter German expectations and rewrite the rulebook on armored operations. The breakout was coming, and the Shermans were ready to run. The American approach to armored warfare was born from a different military tradition than Germany's. When the German army developed its Panther doctrine in the 1930s, it drew on lessons from the First World War: breakthrough, encirclement, annihilation. The goal was to punch through enemy lines with concentrated armor, then destroy trapped forces in massive Kesselschlacht, cauldron battles. This required powerful tanks that could dominate any engagement, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery. Quality over quantity, elite formations striking decisive blows. The United States, entering the tank game later, looked at the same history and reached different conclusions. American theorists, many influenced by the writings of British military thinker J.F.C. Fuller and the success of mechanized cavalry in the American Civil War, believed the future belonged to mobility and exploitation. Tanks weren't siege weapons. They were pursuit weapons. Their job wasn't to fight other tanks. It was to race past enemy strongpoints, cut supply lines, seize crossroads, spread chaos deep in the enemy rear, kill the logistics, paralyze the command structure, force the enemy to retreat or surrender. This doctrine shaped every aspect of Sherman design. The tank needed to be fast, capable of 25 to 30 miles per hour on roads, faster than most German armor. It needed operational range. The Sherman could travel roughly 120 miles on a full tank of fuel, allowing for deep penetrations without constant refueling stops. It needed to be mechanically reliable. Crews had to trust their tank wouldn't break down 50 miles behind enemy lines, and critically, it needed to be maintainable in the field. German tanks were engineering triumphs that required specialized tools, trained mechanics, and factory-level precision to repair. A Panther with transmission problems, a chronic issue, might need to be shipped back to a depot workshop. A Sherman with similar problems could often be fixed by the crew with basic tools in a few hours. American tankers joked that you could repair a Sherman with a wrench and a prayer. This wasn't accident. It was deliberate design philosophy backed by America's greatest strategic advantage: logistics. Behind every Sherman racing across France was an invisible supply chain of staggering complexity. Fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, spare parts convoys, mobile repair battalions, field hospitals, engineer companies to rebuild bridges and clear obstacles. The U.S. Army's supply services performed daily miracles of coordination, ensuring that advancing tank columns never ran dry. Consider the numbers. A single armored division, roughly 15,000 men and 250 tanks, consumed approximately 300,000 gallons of fuel per day during active operations. Add ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and replacement equipment, and you're looking at thousands of tons of material that had to move forward constantly, keeping pace with the advance. The Germans couldn't match this, not even close. By summer 1944, Allied air superiority meant German supply convoys moved only at night, if at all. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. German tanks frequently sat immobile, not because they were destroyed, but because they had no fuel. Crews abandoned perfectly functional Panthers because they couldn't get spare parts. The vaunted German panzer divisions were withering from logistical starvation. Meanwhile, American supply lines stretched from Normandy beaches back across the Atlantic to factories in Michigan and Ohio. An unbroken chain of ships, trucks, trains, and warehouses kept the Sherman columns fed. This created a fundamental asymmetry German commanders struggled to grasp. When they knocked out American tanks, and they did frequently, those losses barely registered at the operational level. The Americans would return the next day with fresh tanks and fresh crews, but when the Americans knocked out German tanks, those losses were often permanent. No replacements coming, no spare parts available, just steadily declining combat power. The psychological impact was devastating. German tankers knew they were fighting an enemy that couldn't be bled dry, couldn't be exhausted, couldn't be stopped by tactical victories. You could kill 10 Shermans for every Panther lost and still be losing the war. It was like fighting the ocean. Destroy one wave and another crashes forward immediately. This industrial reality shaped American tactics in Normandy and beyond. Sherman platoons didn't try to outduel Tigers at long range. They used speed and numbers to flank, overwhelm, and bypass. If a German heavy tank blocked a road, the Americans would go around. Send one platoon to fix the enemy in place while 3 more raced past to hit supply lines and headquarters positions. The Sherman's speed made this possible. Top speed on roads, 25 miles per hour sustained, bursts up to 30. Cross-country, 15 miles per hour on good terrain. This doesn't sound revolutionary by modern standards, but in 1944, it was extraordinary. German tanks, heavier, more complex, struggled to maintain such pace. The Panther could theoretically match the Sherman's speed, but transmission failures and engine problems meant it rarely did. The Tiger was slower still, a ponderous fortress on tracks. Speed created opportunities. Speed allowed exploitation. Speed turned breakthrough into collapse. And in late July 1944, the Americans were about to demonstrate just how devastating speed could be when unleashed across open terrain, with no obstacles to slow the advance. The hedgerow stalemate was ending. Engineers had developed the Rhino hedge cutter, steel tusks welded to Sherman hulls that could punch through the ancient earthworks. Artillery tactics improved. Infantry armor coordination sharpened. Most importantly, a plan was taking shape. Operation Cobra. A concentrated aerial bombardment would blow a hole in German lines south of St. Lo. Then American armor would pour through the gap like water through a broken dam. Not to fight for every field and village, but to run. Race south, then wheel east. Cut off German forces in Normandy. Don't give them time to establish new defensive lines. George S. Patton, who'd spent weeks chafing in England waiting for his moment, would lead this exploitation. His Third Army, built around armored divisions equipped with thousands of Shermans, was designed for one purpose: speed and pursuit. Patton understood the Sherman's strengths better than most. He didn't mourn its thin armor or weaker gun. He celebrated its mobility and reliability. "I don't want them to dig in," he told his staff. "I want them running scared. We hit them fast and we don't stop until we run out of gas or Germans, whichever comes first." The German defenders facing this onslaught were exhausted, understrength, and increasingly hopeless. Weeks of attritional combat had ground down their forces. Promised reinforcements never arrived. Air attacks destroyed supply columns. Every day brought fresh reports of Allied numerical superiority, but they still believed, many of them, that German tactical skill and superior equipment would prevail. That the Americans, for all their resources, lacked the Wehrmacht's fighting spirit and battlefield excellence. That when the Americans finally tried to break out, they'd bleed themselves dry against prepared defenses. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The Shermans were already moving into position. Thousands of them, engines idling, crews checking maps and radios, fuel trucks topping off every tank, ammunition stacked and ready, the entire mechanized weight of American industrial might, poised to explode forward, not to conquer, to race. Angle 1, the human shock. The first German reports came through on July 26, 1944, just hours after Operation Cobra began. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion in the 21st Panzer Division, received a frantic radio call from one of his forward units. The voice on the other end was barely coherent, not from static but from panic. "Sir, American panzers, they're not stopping. They're not consolidating. They're everywhere." Von Luck, a veteran of the Eastern Front and North Africa, had seen plenty of combat. He'd faced Soviet tank charges and British armor in the desert. But what his scouts were describing didn't match any doctrine he knew. The Americans weren't advancing methodically, establishing defensive positions as they captured terrain. They were racing, entire columns bypassing his positions, ignoring flanks, pushing south at speeds that seemed reckless. "How many?" he asked. Silence. Then, "I've stopped counting, sir." German soldiers in foxholes watched in disbelief as Sherman columns rumbled past their positions without stopping to engage. In traditional warfare, this was suicide. You never advanced past enemy strong points without clearing them first. But the Americans weren't following traditional rules. They were following a new calculus. Speed matters more than security. "Keep moving. Let the infantry clean up behind you." A Panzer grenadier corporal named Friedrich Weber wrote in his diary, "Today I saw something I cannot explain to anyone who wasn't here. American tanks moving in broad daylight in massive columns, not even attempting concealment. They move like they own the world. Perhaps they do." The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German troops who'd been trained to believe in their tactical and technical superiority suddenly faced an enemy who didn't care about their advantages. Yes, a Tiger could kill 3 Shermans before being destroyed, but while that duel happened, 30 more Shermans had driven past to capture the headquarters, the supply depot, and the crossroads 20 miles behind the line. By July 28th, German radio intercepts revealed growing panic. Unit commanders couldn't track American movements. Tank columns appeared in impossible locations, deep in the rear, cutting roads, seizing bridges before defenders could react. The Americans were moving faster than German intelligence could process. One regimental commander radioed his division, "Request permission to withdraw. Enemy armor has bypassed our position and is now operating in our rear. We have no communications with Corps headquarters and believe they may be overrun." The response came 12 hours later, by motorcycle courier, because American tanks had cut the telephone lines. "Hold position. Reinforcements coming." The reinforcements never came. They were stuck in traffic jams created by retreating units fleeing other Sherman breakthroughs. Angle 2. Technological design. The Sherman's speed advantage wasn't magic. It was engineering. At the heart of every M4 Sherman sat either a Continental R975 radial engine, originally designed for aircraft, or a Ford GAA V8, a massive 500 horsepower engine that Ford engineers had specifically developed for tank use. Both engines were oversized for the Sherman's weight class, giving the tank an exceptional power-to-weight ratio of roughly 16 horsepower per ton. Compare this to German designs. The Panther, at 45 tons with a 700 horsepower engine, achieved about 15.5 horsepower per ton. The Tiger, at 56 tons with the same engine, managed only 12.5. The Sherman, at 30 tons with 500 horsepower, could match or exceed their acceleration and sustained speed despite having less total power. Weight was the key factor. American designers made a conscious decision to sacrifice armor thickness for mobility. The Sherman's frontal armor was 51 mm thick, adequate against most German anti-tank weapons at range, but vulnerable to the powerful 88 mm guns and Panther's 75-meter German tankers could and did penetrate Shermans frontally with disturbing regularity. But the Americans accepted this trade-off because speed itself was a form of protection. A fast-moving target is harder to hit than a slow one. A tank that's 50 miles away in 6 hours is safer than one still crawling through the kill zone. Tactical vulnerability became operational invulnerability. The Sherman suspension system, vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, was simple, rugged, and easy to maintain. It gave the tank a relatively smooth ride even at high speeds across rough terrain. Crews could sustain 20-mile-per-hour cross-country movement for hours without mechanical failure, something German crews in Panthers and Tigers could rarely match. Track design mattered too. The Sherman used rubber block tracks that gripped road surfaces excellently, allowing high-speed movement on paved roads without the track-shedding problems that plagued German designs. When a Sherman threw a track, and all tanks did eventually, it could be repaired in 30 minutes by the crew. A Panther with thrown tracks often needed specialized repair vehicles and hours of work. Fuel efficiency also played a role, though less dramatically. The Sherman consumed roughly 1.5 miles per gallon, terrible by automotive standards but reasonable for a 30-ton vehicle. This gave it an operational range of 100 to 120 miles, enough for deep penetration operations if supply trucks could keep pace. German tanks consumed similar amounts but had less reliable access to fuel, making their theoretical range irrelevant. The transmission was perhaps the Sherman's greatest mechanical advantage. American automatic transmissions were reliable, easy to operate, and required minimal maintenance. German tanks used complex manual transmissions that were prone to failure. The Panther's transmission was notoriously unreliable, often breaking down after just 150 kilometers of operation. Entire Panther battalions became immobilized not from enemy action, but from mechanical failures. Every design choice in the Sherman reflected the central question: how do we keep this vehicle moving? Not how do we make it invincible, not how do we make it the perfect dueling machine, but how do we ensure it can advance 30 miles today, 40 miles tomorrow, and still be running a week from now? The answer was simplicity, reliability, and speed. Angle 3. Tactical doctrine. The Sherman's speed meant nothing without tactics to exploit it. American armored doctrine in 1944 had evolved considerably from the early war days when tank units operated almost independently. By Normandy, the U.S. Army had perfected combined arms tactics that turned the Sherman's mobility into a devastating weapon system. The basic building block was the combat command, a flexible task force built around tank battalions, but including armored infantry, self-propelled artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance units. These weren't rigid formations, but adaptive teams that could be rapidly reconfigured based on mission requirements. Speed was preserved because supporting elements were all mechanized and trained to move at tank pace. When a Sherman column advanced, it moved in layers. Scout elements, fast M8 Greyhound armored cars or M5 Stuart light tanks, raced ahead to identify obstacles and enemy positions. Behind them came the main tank force, organized into company-sized formations that could quickly deploy off-road if resistance developed. Armored infantry and M3 half-tracks followed closely, ready to dismount and clear any strong points that couldn't be bypassed. Self-propelled artillery, M7 Priest 105mm howitzers on tank chassis, moved with the column, able to stop, fire, and catch up without slowing the advance. When a Sherman unit hit resistance, artillery could be on target within minutes, not hours. Suppress the enemy position, then keep moving. The key tactical principle was exploitation over consolidation. Traditional doctrine said advance, secure, consolidate, then advance again. American armored doctrine in France said advance, bypass, keep advancing. Let follow-on infantry deal with bypassed positions. The tank's job is to maintain momentum, to stay inside the enemy's decision-making cycle. This created chaos in German command structures. When you defend against a methodical advance, you know where the front line is. You can organize reserves, establish fallback positions, coordinate counterattacks. But when enemy armor appears simultaneously in 6 different locations, each moving in different directions, you can't establish a coherent front. You can't send reserves because you don't know where they're needed most. You can't organize a defense because the situation changes faster than you can process it. Sherman platoons were trained to move aggressively, but not recklessly. When encountering obstacles, a defended village, a river crossing, a prepared German position, the platoon leader made a rapid assessment. Can we bypass this? If yes, go around and report position to following infantry. If no, fix the enemy in place with one element while the rest of the platoon flanks. Angle 4. German overconfidence. The German army entered the summer of 1944 with a dangerous delusion. Technological superiority would compensate for numerical inferiority. This wasn't entirely unreasonable. German tankers had legitimate reasons for confidence. In direct combat, their vehicles dominated. A Tiger I could engage Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm gun was virtually useless. The Panther's sloped armor could deflect Sherman rounds even at close range, while its long-barreled 75mm could punch through Sherman armor like paper. Battle reports reinforced this belief. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944, a single Tiger commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed an entire British armored column, over 20 tanks and numerous other vehicles, in 15 minutes. Tales of individual Tiger aces racking up dozens of kills circulated through German units, building a mythology of invincibility. German tankers convinced themselves that American crews were inferior, poorly trained, timid, unwilling to press attacks against determined resistance. "They have the tanks," one Panzer commander wrote, "but not the spirit." This contempt blinded them to what the Americans were actually doing. The Americans weren't trying to win tank versus tank duels. They were trying to win the campaign. They understood that destroying German tanks wasn't the objective. Destroying German armies was. And you destroy armies by cutting their supplies, isolating their units, and forcing them into chaotic retreats where cohesion collapses. German tactical excellence became strategic irrelevance. A Tiger ace who killed 20 Shermans accomplished nothing if those Shermans delayed him long enough for 50 more to capture the fuel depot that supplies his entire division. Tactical victories meant nothing in the face of operational collapse. This overconfidence manifested in concrete mistakes. German commanders positioned their heavy tank battalions to defend key terrain, towns, crossroads, river lines, assuming Americans would have to fight through these positions. Instead, Sherman columns simply went around. By the time German commanders realized what was happening, American tanks were operating in their rear areas, and the supposedly impregnable defensive positions had become irrelevant. The German obsession with kill ratios also blinded them to the true nature of the battle. Wehrmacht reports meticulously tracked how many Shermans they destroyed versus their own losses. "We knocked out 15 enemy tanks and lost only 2 Panthers," they'd report triumphantly. What they failed to grasp was that the Americans didn't care about kill ratios. They cared about ground gained, supplies captured, and enemy forces encircled. Even when reality began to penetrate German consciousness, institutional arrogance prevented adaptation. Suggestions to adopt American-style mobile warfare were dismissed as un-German or incompatible with Panzer traditions. The idea that lighter, faster, more numerous tanks might be superior to heavy, powerful, but scarce ones was heresy to German doctrine. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, watched his carefully planned defenses crumble and couldn't understand why. His tanks were better. His crews were more experienced. His tactics were theoretically sound. Yet the Americans were winning. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. Instead of adapting, German commanders doubled down on failed approaches, committing their precious heavy tanks to counterattacks that achieved local successes but strategic nothing. By early August, some German officers began to grasp the truth. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, wrote in a report, "The enemy's operational tempo exceeds our ability to respond. Their willingness to accept tactical risk for operational gain has created a fundamentally different kind of warfare. Our advantages in individual combat are meaningless when we cannot bring those advantages to bear." But by then, it was too late. The Sherman columns were already racing across France. Angle 5, logistics and fuel behind every advancing. Sherman was an invisible miracle. The fuel arrived on time. This sounds mundane until you understand the scale. By early August 1944, the U.S. Army was operating over 6,000 tanks in France, along with tens of thousands of trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, and other vehicles. This mechanized force consumed approximately 800,000 gallons of fuel per day during active operations. Getting that fuel from refineries in Texas and Oklahoma to tank battalions racing through France required a supply chain of staggering complexity. Tanker ships crossed the Atlantic. Port battalions pumped fuel from ships to storage tanks near the beaches. Truck companies, many of them African-American quartermaster units whose contributions were systematically undervalued, drove jerry cans and fuel trucks forward along designated supply routes. The famous Red Ball Express became operational in late August, dedicated truck convoys running 24 hours a day from Normandy beaches to forward supply dumps. At its peak, Red Ball moved 2,500 tons of supplies daily. Drivers pushed their vehicles to destruction, sleeping in shifts, navigating bombed roads and bypassing traffic jams, driven by the knowledge that divisions were depending on them. But the Americans had an advantage the Germans could never match: air supremacy. Allied fighters and bombers had systematically destroyed German fuel infrastructure, refineries, storage facilities, rail yards, pipelines. By July 1944, Germany was facing a critical fuel shortage. Panzer divisions received fuel allocations measured in liters per kilometer. Tanks sat immobile because moving them consumed fuel needed for future operations. The asymmetry was devastating. An American armored division could launch an attack knowing that fuel trucks were already en route. A German panzer division had to calculate whether it had enough fuel to attack and withdraw if the attack failed. Often they didn't. German tanks rolled into battle knowing they might not have fuel to retreat. This created a vicious cycle. German tanks couldn't maneuver aggressively because they lacked fuel. Their static positions made them vulnerable to American flanking maneuvers. When forced to retreat, they often had to abandon vehicles for lack of fuel. These abandoned vehicles, perfectly functional tanks left beside roads because they couldn't move, became common sights across France. American tank crews, meanwhile, rarely worried about fuel. Their doctrine assumed that supplies would arrive. This confidence enabled aggressive operations. Sherman commanders could push deep into German territory, knowing that fuel trucks would catch up. They could maintain high-speed advances for days because the logistics system was designed to support exactly this kind of operation. The engineering behind this was remarkable. The U.S. Army used standardized jerry cans, simple stackable 5-gallon containers that could be rapidly distributed. Fuel trucks were designed for quick offloading. Forward supply points could be established in hours, not days. The entire system prioritized speed and flexibility. Compare this to German logistics, which remained partially horse-drawn even in 1944. The Wehrmacht still relied on millions of horses to move supplies, and horses couldn't keep pace with mechanized advances. German fuel distribution used a mixture of incompatible containers and delivery systems, creating inefficiencies that cost precious time. Angle 6. Psychological impact. The speed of Sherman columns didn't just defeat German forces militarily, it broke them psychologically. War is as much about morale as material. Soldiers can endure terrible casualties if they believe victory is possible, if they trust their commanders, if they see a path forward. But when the fundamental assumptions of warfare collapse, when the rulebook no longer applies, morale shatters. German soldiers in Normandy watched their world stop making sense. They'd been taught that superior training and equipment would overcome Allied numerical advantages. They'd been told that German tactical brilliance would prevail. They'd seen it work in Poland, France, the Balkans, and the early years in Russia. Then the Shermans came, and nothing worked anymore. You dig a perfect defensive position, sight your anti-tank gun perfectly, wait for the Americans to advance into your kill zone, and they just drive around you. You're still sitting in your foxhole undefeated. When you hear American tanks firing behind you, in what's supposed to be friendly territory, you watch your Tiger knock out 5 enemy tanks, a clear tactical victory, then receive orders to retreat because American armor has captured the supply depot and you have no ammunition for tomorrow. The victory means nothing. You establish a defensive line, call for reinforcements, and learn that the reinforcements are encircled by American units that appeared out of nowhere, moving faster than anyone thought possible. You're supposed to hold, but hold against what? The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. The front line has become meaningless. This cognitive dissonance was devastating. German soldiers began to doubt their commanders, their doctrine, their cause. Reports from this period describe German units, even elite SS formations, simply collapsing when outflanked, surrendering in large groups rather than fighting on. This wasn't cowardice. It was the rational response to impossible circumstances. The psychological impact extended to German commanders. Decision-making became paralyzed because the operational picture changed faster than they could process. By the time a commander issued orders based on current intelligence, that intelligence was hours old and completely inaccurate. American tanks had already moved 50 miles from their last reported position. Some German officers broke under the strain. Others became fatalistic, issuing orders they knew were meaningless because doing nothing felt worse than doing something futile. The Wehrmacht's vaunted command, initiative, the principle that junior officers should make decisions based on local conditions, collapsed because local conditions were incomprehensible. For German soldiers trapped in the Falaise pocket in mid-August, The psychological horror was complete. They were surrounded by an enemy who'd moved too fast to escape, who'd appeared in their rear before they'd even realized the battle was lost. Thousands surrendered not because they'd been defeated in combat, but because continuing to fight seemed pointless. The Americans had already won, and everyone knew it. The speed itself became a weapon of terror. German troops began to fear not just American firepower, but American mobility. The certainty that no position was safe, no rear area secure, no supply line protected. The psychological impact of this fear cannot be overstated. It transformed the Wehrmacht from an aggressive, confident force into a reactive, defensive, increasingly demoralized army that spent more time looking over its shoulder than looking forward. And the Shermans just kept coming. Engines roaring, tracks churning, never stopping, never slowing, racing toward a conclusion that seemed inevitable now to everyone watching. The collapse was, beginning July 25, 1944. 9:38 a.m. The sky above St. Lo fills with thunder. Over 500 American heavy bombers, B-17, flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators appear in formation. Wave after wave stretching back to the horizon. Fighter bombers swarm below them. The air vibrates with the sound of thousands of engines. Then the bombs fall. 4,000 tons of high explosives and napalm obliterate a rectangular target zone 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep. The earth erupts. German positions simply cease to exist. Trenches collapse, bunkers cave in. Entire platoons vanish in rolling walls of flame and concussion. The bombardment lasts 90 minutes. When it ends, the landscape has been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. This is Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, but the bombing, devastating as it is, isn't the weapon that will win this battle. The bombers are just opening the door. The real weapon is already moving forward. Thousands of M4 Sherman tanks, engines running, crews tense, waiting for the signal to advance. At 11 a.m., the signal comes. The 2nd Armored Division, hell on wheels, and leads the assault. Sherman companies roll through the smoke and dust, navigating around craters, pushing through stunned German survivors. Resistance is scattered, disorganized. The bombing has shattered German cohesion. Units are isolated, command posts destroyed, communications severed. By noon, lead elements have penetrated 2 miles. By 3 p.m., 4 miles. The breakthrough is developing faster than planned. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7 Corps, makes a critical decision. Don't wait for infantry to secure the flanks. Keep pushing. Exploit the momentum. He orders his armored divisions to maintain the advance through the night. The Shermans roll through darkness, headlights off, navigating by moonlight and burning vehicles. Crews operate on adrenaline and coffee, pushing their machines and themselves past normal limits. Behind them, German positions that survived the bombing find themselves suddenly isolated, cut off, irrelevant. The Americans aren't clearing territory, they're racing through it. July 26th. The penetration deepens. 10 miles, 12, 15. German commanders scramble to respond. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, is ordered to counterattack, seal the breach, restore the line. But Panzer Lehr has been savaged by weeks of attritional combat. It's at half strength, short on fuel, missing key equipment, and it's facing an entirely different kind of battle than anything it trained for. The Americans don't stop to fight. When Sherman columns encounter German positions, they pin them with part of their force and bypass with the rest. Speed over destruction. Keep moving. By the time Panzer Lehr organizes its counterattack, the Americans are already miles past the positions they're counterattacking toward. July 27th. 20 miles deep now. The breakthrough is becoming a breakout. German defensive lines that looked so solid on maps are revealed as illusions. There's no continuous front, just strong points separated by gaps. The Americans are finding the gaps and pouring through them like water through a cracked dam. Sherman columns are operating independently now. Company and battalion commanders making decisions on the fly, racing toward objectives without waiting for orders. The town of Coutances becomes the first major objective. It sits on a crucial road junction. Capture it and you split German forces, cut their supply lines, open the door to Brittany and the Atlantic ports. Multiple American columns converge on it from different directions simultaneously. German defenders, a mixture of infantry, artillery, and scattered armor, prepare to make a stand. But they're expecting a conventional assault. artillery preparation, infantry probing attacks, methodical reduction of their positions. Instead, Sherman tanks simply charge through the outskirts, firing on the move, bypassing strong points, creating chaos. By July 28th, Coutances falls. The German line in Normandy doesn't bend, it breaks, and waiting in England, monitoring every radio report, is Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army. He's been held in reserve, part of an elaborate deception to make Germans believe a second invasion is coming. But now his moment has arrived. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army becomes operational. He unleashes his armored divisions, the 4th, 6th, and the newly arrived elements of his corps, with simple orders. Advance until you run out of gas. Then call me and I'll find you more. Patton understands the Sherman's strengths instinctively. He doesn't mourn its weaknesses. He celebrates its speed. His entire operational philosophy is built around velocity and aggression. Hit hard, move fast, never let the enemy recover. His lead divisions explode through the Cobra Gap like cavalry of old. But these aren't horses. They're hundreds of 30-ton steel machines capable of moving 25 miles per hour for hours on end, crushing obstacles, firing on the move, advancing through night and day without rest. The German command structure begins to disintegrate. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge receives contradictory reports. American armor spotted near Avranches. American armor reported 30 miles south. American armor operating in Brittany. How is this possible? How can enemy forces be in 3 places simultaneously? His staff scrambles to plot positions on maps, but by the time they mark a location, the Americans have moved, August 2nd. The moment described at the beginning, the German observer watching Sherman columns race past, unable to comprehend what he's seeing. It's happening all across the front now. German soldiers looking up from defensive positions to see American tanks driving past them, not stopping to fight, just rolling south and east like a mechanical tide. The mathematics of breakthrough have shifted. In traditional warfare, the attacker needs 3-to-1 superiority to break through prepared defenses. But when the attacker is moving so fast that the defender can't establish prepared defenses, the ratio becomes irrelevant. The Shermans aren't breaking through German lines. They're driving past positions before those positions can be prepared. Avranches becomes the critical choke point. The town sits at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, where it connects to the rest of France. Every American unit driving south has to pass through it, a single road. A narrow corridor that if cut would trap thousands of vehicles. Hitler, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in East Prussia, sees the opportunity. Destroy the Americans at Avranches, cut off their advance, turn breakthrough into encirclement. He orders a counterattack, Operation Littich. Every available panzer division, including units pulled from other sectors, units that can barely be spared, will converge on Avranches and drive to the coast. On paper, it's Germany's best remaining chance. In reality, it's desperation. The German counterattack launches on August 7th near Mortagne. 4 panzer divisions, roughly 200 tanks, including Tigers and Panthers, strike westward in darkness. Initially, they achieve surprise. American positions are overrun. Infantry units fall back in confusion. But the Germans are still thinking in terms of 1940, when panzer breakthroughs could paralyze entire armies. They're not accounting for American air power, American artillery, and most critically, American mobility. Dawn breaks over Mortagne on August 7th, and the German counterattack stalls. Allied fighter bombers arrive in waves, P-47 Thunderbolts and Royal Air Force Typhoons carrying rockets and bombs. They circle over the battlefield like predators, picking off German tanks exposed in open terrain. The Panthers and Tigers that looked so formidable at night become targets in daylight. Rocket strikes penetrate thin top armor. Bombs crater roads, blocking routes of advance. But it's the American response on the ground that truly dooms the German attack. Patton doesn't panic. He doesn't order a general retreat or defensive consolidation. Instead, he does something the Germans don't anticipate. He ignores the counterattack. Let other units contain Mortagne. His armor will keep advancing south and east. The best defense is a deeper offense. By the time German commanders realize what's happening, it's too late. While they've committed their precious armor reserves to attacking westward toward Avranches, American Sherman columns have raced east and north. beginning a massive envelopment. The Germans aren't cutting off the Americans, they're putting their heads into a noose. August 8th. American forces capture Le Mans, 90 miles from Normandy. 90 miles in 1 week. Sherman crews are exhausted, sleeping in their tanks during brief refueling stops, subsisting on rations and coffee. Maintenance crews work miracles keeping the vehicles running, but the advance doesn't slow. Patton's operational tempo is relentless. When a division reports it needs time to rest and refit, he gives them 4 hours and orders them back on the road. The enemy is running, he tells his staff. We stop when they stop. Not before. The speed creates cascading problems for German forces. Supply columns attempting to move forward run into American tanks that weren't supposed to be there. Headquarters units find themselves under fire from enemies that were reported miles away hours earlier. Communication lines are cut faster than they can be repaired. German units in Normandy begin to recognize their situation. They're being encircled. American forces are driving north from Le Mans while British and Canadian forces push south from Caen. The gap between them is closing. Hundreds of thousands of German troops, the entire 7th Army and major elements of the 5th Panzer Army are at risk of being trapped in a Pocketpunkt. Field Marshal von Kluge pleads with Hitler for permission to withdraw. The Führer refuses. No retreat, counterattack, restore the line. Orders that are impossible to execute but mandatory to attempt. By August 12th, the reality is undeniable. The pocket is forming. German forces are compressed into an ever-shrinking area, centered on the town of Falaise. The only escape route is a narrow gap to the east, and that gap is closing as American and Canadian forces race toward each other. Sherman tanks of the 90th Infantry Division push through Argentan from the south. Canadian and Polish armor drive toward Falaise from the north. Between them, chaos reigns. Thousands of German vehicles, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, jam every road trying to escape eastward before the trap closes. Allied artillery and air power pound the columns mercilessly. The roads become graveyards of burning vehicles and dead horses, twisted metal and abandoned equipment. The speed that brought the Shermans here now becomes executioner. German units trying to retreat encounter American tanks that have already seized crossroads and bridges. What should have been escape routes are killing zones. Entire battalions surrender rather than die in hopeless rearguard actions. August 13th. The gap narrows to 12 miles. German soldiers abandoning vehicles and fleeing on foot. Officers burning documents, destroying equipment, trying to salvage anything they can. Some units maintain discipline, fighting desperate rearguard actions to buy time for others to escape. Other units simply disintegrate, men scattering into the countryside hoping to evade capture. The human cost is staggering. Thousands of German soldiers die in the pocket, killed by artillery, airstrikes, or in last-stand defensive battles. Tens of thousands more are captured. The roads through the gap become impassable, choked with wreckage and bodies. Polish armored units, Sherman tanks with white and red markings, fight their way onto Hill 262, a crucial piece of high ground overlooking the escape routes. From this position, they call in artillery on German columns trying to break out. The Polish soldiers, many of them fighting to avenge their occupied homeland, show no mercy. August 19th. The Falaise pocket is closed. Not completely. Some Germans escape through the narrowing gap before it seals, including enough officers and equipment to form the nucleus of future units. But the scale of the disaster is unprecedented. Over 50,000 German soldiers are captured. Another 10,000 are dead. Thousands of vehicles destroyed or abandoned, including approximately 200 tanks and self-propelled guns. The wreckage is so extensive that journalists and soldiers who see it struggle to describe the scene. One American officer calls it scenes from Dante's Inferno. Miles of road packed with destroyed equipment, dead soldiers and horses, abandoned weapons. The smell of death hangs over the battlefield for weeks, but the statistics only tell part of the story. The true significance is organizational. The Germans haven't just lost men and equipment, they've lost cohesion. The 7th Army essentially ceases to exist as a functional formation. Veteran units that survived France, Russia, and North Africa are shattered. The carefully built combat experience of years is obliterated in weeks. And the Shermans, battered, many showing battle damage, crews running on fumes of exhaustion, are already racing toward the next objective. Paris. The French capital sits 120 miles from Falaise. In World War I, that distance took months to traverse. In 1940, the Germans covered it in weeks. In August 1944, Patton's armor covers it in days. The liberation of Paris wasn't originally part of the plan. Allied commanders wanted to bypass the city, avoid urban combat, maintain momentum toward Germany. But the French resistance rises up inside Paris on August 19th. The German garrison, 15,000 troops, prepares to suppress the uprising. Hitler orders the city defended to the last man and, if necessary, destroyed. Eisenhower makes the decision: liberate Paris, and he gives the honor to the French 2nd Armored Division under General Philippe Leclerc, but they'll advance, alongside American units equipped with Shermans. August 24, Leclerc's division, supported by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, races toward Paris. They cover 50 miles in one day, an astonishing pace even by the standards of the August breakout. Sherman tanks emblazoned with French flags roar down roads lined with cheering civilians. Villages hang out tricolor banners as the columns pass. August 25th. The first Allied tanks, French Shermans, enter Paris. The German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, surrenders the city rather than destroy it. Whether he acts from humanity or pragmatism doesn't matter. Paris is free. The scenes of celebration are captured on film. Sherman tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées, crowds of Parisians climbing onto the vehicles, kissing the crews, waving flags. American and French soldiers embraced like heroes. The psychological impact reverberates across Europe. If Paris can be liberated this quickly, what city is safe? By the end of August, Allied forces have advanced over 200 miles from the Normandy beaches. They've liberated virtually all of France north of the Loire River. They've destroyed 2 German armies and inflicted over 400,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, or captured, and they've done it in 8 weeks. The speed of advance shocks military observers worldwide. Soviet commanders, grinding through Belarus and Poland at tremendous cost, watch the Western Allies race across France and reassess their assumptions about mechanized warfare. Japanese officers, still clinging to Pacific Islands, read reports of Sherman columns and realize the same industrial might will eventually be turned against them. But the Americans are outrunning their supply lines now. Patton's tanks are covering distances so vast that fuel trucks can't keep pace. Some divisions literally run out of gas and sit idle for days waiting for supplies. The famous Red Ball Express is operating at maximum capacity, but can't sustain the pace. The advance slows not because of German resistance, but because of logistics. The Shermans have run farther and faster than anyone planned. They've demonstrated that mechanized warfare, when executed with American industrial backing and proper doctrine, can achieve operational results that seemed impossible just months earlier. German commanders watched the Allied advance grind to a halt near the German border in early September and allow themselves a moment of hope. Maybe the worst is over. Maybe they can stabilize. Maybe they can hold the Rhine. They don't understand yet that the pause is temporary, that the Americans are building supply depots, bringing up fuel and ammunition, preparing for the next offensive, that the Shermans are being refueled and repaired, crews rested and reinforced. The machine that broke France isn't broken. It's just catching its breath. September 1944. The Western Front stabilizes, but nothing will ever be the same. The numbers tell one story. Between June 6 and August 31, 1944, the Western Allies inflicted approximately 450,000 casualties on German forces in France, killed, wounded, or captured. The Wehrmacht lost over 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 3,500 artillery pieces, and 20,000 vehicles of various types. Entire divisions were erased from the order of battle, but numbers alone don't capture the magnitude of the catastrophe that befell the German army in the West. The WWII organizational damage was worse than the material losses. The Wehrmacht's carefully cultivated professional NCO corps, sergeants and junior officers with years of combat experience, was gutted. These were the men who held units together in crisis, who could make tactical decisions under pressure, who trained replacements and maintained unit cohesion. Thousands of them died in Normandy or languished in POW cages. They couldn't be replaced. Combat divisions that entered Normandy with 15,000 men emerged with 3,000, their organic structure destroyed. Some storied units, the Panzer Lehr Division for example, were so thoroughly shattered that they had to be completely rebuilt from scratch. The reconstituted divisions bore the same names and carried the same traditions, but they were shadows of their former selves. The speed of the collapse made recovery impossible. In previous campaigns, when German forces suffered defeats, they'd been able to conduct organized withdrawals, saving equipment and personnel to fight another day. But the velocity of the American pursuit in August 1944 prevented this. Units that would have conducted textbook retreats in 1941 simply disintegrated when they couldn't move faster than pursuing Shermans. Surviving, German soldiers who made it back to Germany brought with them something more corrosive than defeat: doubt. They'd seen the unstoppable advance. They'd watched American tanks appear in impossible locations at impossible speeds. They'd witnessed the collapse of positions that should have been defensible. And they'd learned that German technological superiority, the Tigers and Panthers they'd been taught to trust, meant nothing against an enemy who simply went around them. This psychological damage rippled through the Wehrmacht. Replacement troops arriving at the front heard veterans' stories and absorbed their fatalism. The Americans have unlimited tanks, they'd say. They never stop moving. You can't fight them and win, only delay them. This wasn't cowardice. It was brutal realism from men who'd learned it the hard way. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence officers studied the campaign results with professional satisfaction. The breakout from Normandy validated years of doctrinal development. The Sherman, which had been criticized by some American officers who wanted heavier, more powerful tanks, had proven itself exactly as designed, not as a dueling vehicle but as an instrument of operational warfare. Combat. Loss reports showed the Sherman's vulnerability in direct engagements. American tank battalions lost approximately 580 Shermans destroyed in France during July and August. But those same reports showed that losses were sustainable and replaceable. Destroyed Shermans were replaced within days. Crews were rotated out, given new tanks, and sent back into action. The machine kept running. German tank losses, proportionally smaller in some engagements, were catastrophic at the strategic level because they couldn't be replaced. Every destroyed Panther or Tiger represented a permanent loss. Germany's industrial capacity couldn't match losses, couldn't provide spare parts, couldn't train enough crews. The Wehrmacht's armored strength was bleeding out. The territorial gains were staggering when mapped. France, which had taken Germany 6 weeks to conquer in 1940, was liberated in 3 months. Belgium followed in days. By mid-September, Allied forces stood on the German border itself. The Rhine River, the historic barrier that had protected Germany for centuries. German civilians, who'd been insulated from the war by Goebbels' propaganda, suddenly faced reality. Allied bombers had brought the war to German cities, yes, but that was distant, impersonal. Now the front was collapsing. Now enemy armies stood at the border. Now wounded soldiers flooded back into Germany with stories of defeat. The strategic situation was irrecoverable. Germany now faced enemies on 3 fronts: the Western Allies pressing from France, the Soviets driving through Poland toward Berlin, and the Italians, once allies, allowing Allied armies to push north up the Italian peninsula. The noose was tightening. Hitler's response was characteristically delusional. He blamed commanders for the defeat, dismissed von Kluge, who subsequently committed suicide, and began planning counteroffensives. "We'll throw them back into the sea," he told his staff. "The Americans have overextended. We'll cut them off and destroy them." This fantasy would manifest in December 1944 as the Battle of the Bulge, one last desperate German offensive in the Ardennes. But the Bulge would prove once again that German tactical skill couldn't overcome American operational advantages. The same pattern would repeat: initial German success, then American reinforcements arriving with impossible speed, Sherman tanks racing to encircle the penetration, and German forces ground down by attrition they couldn't sustain. The Sherman's performance in France sparked intense debate within military circles that would continue long after the war ended. Critics pointed to the tank's vulnerabilities. American tankers called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, lights first time every time, because Shermans had a disturbing tendency to catch fire when penetrated. The early models used gasoline engines and stored ammunition in configurations that turned the tank into a death trap when hit. Crew survivability statistics were sobering. A penetrating hit had roughly a 60% chance of causing catastrophic fire. German veterans cited examples of single Tiger tanks destroying entire Sherman platoons. Panther crews described hitting Shermans frontally at ranges where American return fire was ineffective. The technical inferiority in armor protection and main gun penetration was undeniable. Yet the defenders of American doctrine had a devastating counterargument. We won, not just tactically, operationally, and strategically. The Sherman accomplished its mission. It got American armies across France faster than any military force in history had traversed comparable distances. It provided the mobility that turned breakthrough into collapse, that transformed tactical victories into strategic triumph. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, summarized it perfectly in his post-war memoir. Critics who never fought in France don't understand. We weren't trying to build a tank that could beat a Tiger in single combat. We were building a tank that could win the war. And it did. The casualty exchange ratios, when examined honestly, were complex. Yes, German tanks achieved better kill-to-loss ratios in direct combat, sometimes dramatically so. A single Tiger might destroy 5 or 6 Shermans before being knocked out. But when you factor in tanks lost to mechanical failure, air attack, artillery, and most critically, tanks abandoned for lack of fuel or when their positions were outflanked, the picture shifts. American after-action reports estimated that only about 20% of Sherman losses came from direct tank-versus-tank combat. The majority were lost to anti-tank guns, mines, artillery, and mechanical failures. Meanwhile, German tanks were being lost to all those same causes, plus the operational collapse that forced crews to destroy or abandon functional vehicles. By war's end, American factories had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans in various configurations. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Even if every German tank destroyed 5 Shermans, Germany would still run out of tanks first. The psychological aftermath extended beyond military circles. German civilians and soldiers struggled to process how the supposedly inferior Americans had defeated them so comprehensively. Nazi ideology had taught that Germans were racially superior, that German engineering was unmatched, that German military prowess would prevail. The collapse in France shattered these myths. Post-war interviews with German POWs revealed a recurring theme: shock at American material abundance. They waste ammunition like we waste water, one prisoner observed. Their columns stretched to the horizon, tanks, trucks, supplies, everything. We knew we couldn't beat that. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with unlimited resources couldn't be quantified, but was perhaps the Sherman's greatest weapon. For the Western Allies, the campaign validated the American way of war: industrial mass production, logistical excellence, and operational mobility over tactical perfection. This approach would define American military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Quality was important, yes, but quantity combined with adequate quality and superior logistics was overwhelming. The Sherman continued to serve long after Germany's surrender. It fought in the Pacific, helping to liberate the Philippines and supporting the final island assaults on Japan. Post-war Shermans were supplied to dozens of allied nations. Israeli Shermans fought in the 1967 Six-Day War, more than 20 years after the tanks rolled through France. Some variants remained in service into the 1970s, but the Sherman's greatest legacy wasn't its longevity, it was what it represented. About modern warfare, the tank demonstrated that in industrial-age combat, operational mobility matters more than tactical invincibility, that sustainable production trumps technical perfection, that keeping thousands of adequate machines running beats keeping hundreds of superior machines in the repair depot, that speed and reliability can be decisive advantages even against heavier armor and more powerful guns. German commanders learned these lessons too late. In prisoner of war camps, German officers held lengthy discussions about where they'd gone wrong. Many concluded that Germany had lost the war not on the battlefield, but in the factory, that American industrial capacity, not American tactical skill, had been the decisive factor. They were both right and wrong. American industrial capacity was indeed decisive, but it was industrial capacity harnessed to a coherent operational doctrine. The Sherman wasn't just a product of American factories, it was the embodiment of American military philosophy. Build it fast, build it reliable, build it in numbers, and above all, build it to move. The post-war U.S. Army studied the France campaign intensively. The lessons learned would shape the next generation of American armor. The M26 Pershing, developed late in the war, represented an attempt to address the Sherman's firepower and armor deficiencies while maintaining its mobility advantages. Its successor, the M46 Patton tank, would carry George Patton's name into the Korean War, a tribute to the general who'd best understood how to use armor's speed as a weapon. Soviet observers drew their own conclusions. Stalin's armies had ground through Eastern Europe in a very different kind of armored warfare. Massive tank armies in frontal assaults, accepting horrendous casualties to maintain pressure. But Soviet military theorists studied the American breakout and incorporated its lessons into their own doctrine, developing the concept of deep operations that emphasized rapid exploitation and operational tempo. The French, rebuilding their shattered army, initially wanted heavy tanks to match German designs. American advisors convinced them otherwise. Speed won the campaign. Logistics won the war. Build what you can sustain. France's post-war armor development emphasized mobile, reliable designs over heavy breakthrough tanks. Only the British seemed to partially miss the lesson, continuing to develop heavily armored infantry tanks and faster cruiser tanks in separate lines, the old pre-war distinction that American doctrine had abandoned. It would take another generation before British armor fully embraced the American model of multi-role, mobile, sustainable designs. For American tankers who'd fought across France, the memories were complicated. They'd lost friends to German fire, men burning alive in Shermans hit by 88mm rounds, crews killed by Panthers they never saw. The technical inferiority had been real, the danger constant. Many carried psychological scars from that summer, but they'd also experienced something extraordinary. The power of an army in full, unstoppable advance. The exhilaration of racing across liberated France, of watching German positions collapse, of covering in days what armies in the previous war had struggled for months to achieve. They'd been part of a military revolution, whether they understood it at the time or not. The Sherman's reputation would fluctuate in subsequent decades. Military historians debated its merits endlessly. Some called it a death trap that sacrificed American lives to industrial expedience. Others praised it as a war-winning design perfectly suited to its mission. The arguments continue even today among enthusiasts and scholars. But in the end, one fact remains unchallengeable. In the summer of 1944, when American Sherman tank columns raced across France at speeds German defenders couldn't comprehend, when entire German armies collapsed not from direct defeat but from operational paralysis, when Paris was liberated and the Reich's western frontier breached in 8 weeks, the Sherman did exactly what it was designed to do. It moved fast enough to win, and sometimes, in war, that's all that matters. There's a photograph from August 1944, grainy and black and white, that captures something the statistics never could. It shows a Sherman tank, dusty, battle-scarred, track guards dented, rolling down a French country road. A young American tanker sits in the commander's hatch, grinning despite obvious exhaustion. Beside the road, an elderly French farmer stands with his hat in his hands, tears streaming down his face. Between them is the distance of a generation, a language barrier, an ocean. But in that moment they understand each other perfectly. The tank is freedom, arriving at 25 miles per hour. The story of the Sherman's speed across France is ultimately a story about choices, about what you optimize for when you can't optimize for everything. The Germans chose power and protection, creating tanks that were masterpieces of engineering but nightmares of logistics. The Americans chose mobility and reliability, accepting tactical vulnerabilities to achieve operational dominance. History rendered its verdict in the summer of 1944, and the verdict was decisive. But the deeper lesson transcends tank design. It's about how wars are actually won, not through superior weapons alone, but through the integration of production, logistics, doctrine, and operational tempo into a coherent system. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a manifestation of American strategic culture, of a nation that could outproduce, outsustain, and outmove any opponent. Those German soldiers watching Sherman columns race past their positions weren't just witnessing the advance of enemy armor. They were witnessing the collision of two different philosophies of warfare, two different ways of organizing industrial societies for conflict. And they were learning, too late, that their side had bet on the wrong philosophy. There's a certain tragedy in the German experience. They'd built magnificent machines, tigers and panthers that remain legendary decades later. They'd trained superb crews and developed sophisticated tactics. They'd done everything their doctrine told them to do, and they lost anyway, comprehensively and irreversibly, because the rules of warfare had changed in ways their doctrine couldn't accommodate. The Sherman speed represented something profound, the industrialization of war reaching its logical conclusion. Not the craftsman's approach of building perfect machines in small numbers, but the factory approach of building adequate machines in overwhelming quantities. Not the artist's vision of decisive battle, but the engineer's calculation of sustainable operations. It was, in its own way, very American, pragmatic over elegant, effective over impressive, focused on the outcome rather than the process. And when those Sherman columns finally stopped, engines idling on the banks of the Rhine, looking across into Germany itself, the men inside them could be forgiven for feeling a certain grim satisfaction. They'd crossed a continent. They'd liberated nations. They'd broken armies that everyone said were unbeatable. They'd done it not by being invincible, but by being unstoppable. There's a difference, it turns out, and that difference decided a war.